In this lecture, we'll talk about some classic sociolinguistic studies, just to deepen our understanding of the concepts that I introduced in the preceding lecture. Most of the studies here are focusing on English dialects spoken in either the US or Britain. We're going to look a bit more at Canada in lecture 4 next week. So we're going to look at 5 case studies. The first one is a very, very famous study done by William Labov, who is considered the father of modern sociolinguistics. So he really started this entire field. So he did one of his really early work was on R in New York City. The variable they looked at in the study was how R is pronounced after vowels. So there were 2 variants. So a word like floor could be pronounced floor or something like flow, which the second one is the non-standard. Right? Floor is the prestige. Similarly, a word like fourth could be pronounced either as fourth or as fourth, right, without an R. Okay, so the variable basically is R pronounced or not? So his research question was, there's variation here. How does this variation in the pronunciation of R depend on both class, so the speaker's class, and the style, right? So the style that the speaker was using. So he used a methodology that's very famous now. So he did a study in 3 department stores. So he went to Saks, which is a sort of fancy department store. He went to Macy's, which was just a kind of ordinary mid-range. And then he went to S. Klein, which was a sort of cheap store associated with more like working class. So the assumption is that these 3 stores are going to be mostly frequented by people of 3 different classes or groups of classes, and that also the employees will kind of talk more like the people in those 3 different classes. What he did then is that he went into each store and he went up to various employees and he asked them about, where do I find such and such a department, some department that he knew was on the 4th floor. Right? Basically, he was trying to force the employees to say 4th floor. Okay. So he would say something like, excuse me, could you tell me where men's footwear is? And the employee would say, oh, it's on the 4th floor. So he was kind of being clever here because that answer is 2 pieces of data, right? The word 4th and the word floor, they both have R after vowels. Okay, so looking at how people in Saks and Macy's and S. Klein, 3 different classes, presumably, how they pronounce 4th floor or 4th flow, that gives him his data that he's looking for there for class. Okay, that's what he did. And then after they answered, then he pretended he didn't hear them. And he asked them to repeat themselves. So he said, sorry, what was that? And then they would say, on the 4th floor. So why did he get them to do that? Well, now he's manipulating style. Right? So the first time they answered, they were speaking kind of naturally. But now that he said he couldn't understand, and they're going to repeat themselves, they're going to speak a bit more clearly and a bit more carefully. Right? So they're going to use a more careful and more formal style. Okay? So this gives another set of data. Right? Now we're not just looking at class, but even within each class, we're looking at style. Now I want to point out something, which is that nowadays you could never do a study like this. It would be considered very unethical to conduct an experiment on people without their consent. Right? Now nobody is harmed in an experiment like this. It's still not considered ethical. But this was in the 60s and things were different. So the results. Right? So here's a graph that shows how often the R was pronounced. Okay, so pronouncing the R is the prestige variant. Right? So how often do people use the prestige variant? And we have 2 repetitions. So we've got Saks, Macy's, and S. Klein. The orange bar was the initial response. The red bar was the second repetition. So what you see first is a very strong affective class. Right? So the people at Saks used R most of the time. The people at S. Klein used very little R, and the people at Macy's were in the middle. Okay, so there was an effective class, as we would expect with the prestige variant, and there was also an effective context. Right? So if you look at the repetition, so look at S. Klein, on the repetition they went from 8% R to 18%. At Macy's they went from 44% R to 61%. So in that more careful style, they used more R. Sax, it was about level, right? So they were using as much R as they're going to use even in the initial response. So that was, very, very clear findings on how both class and style context have an effect on the on the patterning of a variable. So this was just one technique that Labov used. He also did interviews using various different techniques to elicit different styles. Talked a little bit about this in the previous lecture. So to get casual speech, he used free conversation, right? Just sit down and chat with someone. And this gets their kind of least careful, most casual kind of speech. To get more careful, more formal speech, it would be question and answer. Even more formal, get them to read sentences and paragraphs. More formal still, get them to read single words, right? So reading a word, you're going to be even more careful than reading a sentence, right? Because you really focus on that word. And then the most careful speech of all, he got them to read minimal pairs, right? So read both floor and flow. If you're someone who tends to drop the R in floor, this is the place where you might not drop it, right? Because you got that contrast with flow, and you don't want to pronounce floor and flow the same way. So if you have an R at all, you might bring it out in a minimal pair test. Okay, so Labov got people to do this, and then he counted up how people pronounced R in each of these different styles for each speaker. And he plotted this according to the speaker's class. And he distinguished a whole bunch of classes based on occupation, income, and so on. So here's a graph of all of this. Okay? So up the side, we have how often do they pronounce R. So how often do they use the prestige variant. Along the bottom, we've got our styles, right, going from casual speech, which is the least careful style, across to reading minimal pairs, which is the most careful style. And then our lines are our different classes. Right? So Labov distinguished 6 different classes. So if you look at it, it's a pretty clear, pretty clean pattern. Right? So if you go from least careful to most careful style, the use of R goes up and up and up in each style. Right? So casual speech, everyone is using the least R. Minimal pairs, everyone is using the most R. There's also a pretty clear effect of class in that the lowest class has got the lowest use of R across the board, right? And then class 2 a bit more, class 3 a bit more, and so on, right? And the higher classes use the most R. There's one exception, however. So if you look at your top 2 classes, class 5 and class 6, what you see is that it starts out as you'd expect, right? In casual speech, class 6 uses it the most, class 5 uses it a bit less, and then as you get more careful, it goes up. But what we see is that at some point, class 5 overtakes class 6. The second highest class, in the more careful styles, the word list and the minimal pairs, they use R, the prestige variant, even more than the highest class does. I alluded to this. This is a pattern that I alluded to in the preceding lecture. So we're going to talk a bit more about that in a second. Right? The term for this is called the crossover effect. Right? So the crossover effect is when the second highest class ends up using a prestige variant even more than the highest class does. Okay, so they cross over the highest class. Okay, so what do we conclude from Labov's studies? So we can see that both class and style play a role in determining variation. Of course, nowadays we know this, we take this for granted, but this is how Labov actually established that these factors are interesting. Another important point is that everyone uses both, right? It's not the case that lower classes always drop the R and higher classes always use the R. Everybody has both variants. And it's just the difference is in how much do you use with each variant, right? So the lower classes don't use it as much as the higher classes do. And then there's this crossover effect, right? So the more formal you get in more formal styles, there comes a point at which the second highest class starts speaking even more formally than the higher class does. The term that Labov used for this, he saw this as a symptom of linguistic insecurity. So there was a famous ad campaign by a car rental company some time ago. When you're number 2, you try harder. Right? The idea being that if you're in second place, you're almost in first place, right? So you're very, very conscious that you're almost at the top, but not quite. And that kind of gives you an incentive to try harder, right, when you're in number two, because you could be number one if only you tried harder. So that seems to be what's happening with this second highest class, right? These are people who, they're pretty high on the ladder, but they're aware they're not all the way up, right? Because they're almost there, but not all the way there. So they're kind of making a really strong effort, especially in formal styles, to sound really, really high class, right? Because they can sort of taste the victory, right? They're almost number one. So that's thought to be what's responsible for the crossover effect. It's this sort of linguistic insecurity, and that the second highest class really, really wants to be even higher in class, right? So they use the prestige variables even more than the highest class does.